Okay, kia ora koutou. Thank you for joining us tonight for this Para Kal home composting workshop. My name's Kate, I'm from KaiCycle along with Tom here, and Kim from the Sustainability Trust, who's the tech wizard tonight, who'll be staying in the background. So just a reminder to please keep your microphone and video off for the duration of the workshop. Any questions you have, you can fire through using the chat function at any point. Tom will be on the chat looking at those questions, answering a few as we go, and we'll save some for the last 10 or 15 minutes when we'll do our Q&A session. We'll also be saving the chat and answering any questions we don't get to later on in a blog post. This is also being recorded so that you can find it online and refer to it if you want to in the future. So thanks again for joining us, and let's crack into it. Great, so this workshop's been brought to you by Wellington City Council, Sustainability Trust and KaiCycle. Just a little bit of background about KaiCycle. We're an urban farming and community scale composting initiative based in Newtown. We run a composting service where we collect food scraps from local households and businesses, bring it back to our farm on our e-bikes, compost it and use it to grow our kai. But Tom actually does a lot more of the cycling than I do. And Sustainability Trust is a social enterprise based off Tory Street, and they support sustainable living. They help create warmer, more energy efficient homes, help people to reduce their impact on the environment, and they give all their profits back to the community. So their Eco Shop and Curtain Bank down the bottom there are just two of the awesome things they offer. So if you haven't already been to see them on Foresters Lane, definitely worth a visit. But we'll crack into the workshop now, and I just wanted to open with a Karakia Timatanga. So please do stay on mute, but feel free to follow along wherever you are. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atukura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu. Tihei mauri ora. Kia ora. So a bit about Para Kal. You probably know a fair bit about it as you've already signed up. It can be pretty much translated as food waste in te reo. It's a 12-month trial being run by Wellington City Council to reduce the amount of food waste going to landfill, and the Miramar Peninsula is of course the location for this trial. So this is pretty exciting. It's happening in two different ways. There's a curbside collection part, and there's also a home composting part. So I just want to say, I guess, congrats and thank you to you all for signing up for the home composting part of the trial. It's really awesome to have you on board for this. And throughout this 12-month trial, it's essentially a research project. You're the citizen scientists. It's gathering info to figure out how we can design a citywide solution for our food waste. So just a quick overview to what's happening with our workshop today. I'm going to take you through quickly about the issue of food waste and composting, why it's important and how we do it, focusing in on with a bit more detail on the three different systems which you've signed up for one of. Then we'll just go through what's happening with the rest of the trial, have our Q&A session, and we'll aim to be wrapped up by 7:30. So what is the problem with food waste? It is indeed a problem. We throw out 3.2 kilos on average of food waste every week from every household. And while that might not seem like a huge amount, it does add up collectively to over 30,000 tonnes of food waste a year that we're sending to the landfill in our yellow rubbish bags. So that's an issue because when food waste gets buried in the landfill under earth and all our other rubbish, it doesn't break down the way it's meant to. It breaks down very, very slowly, releasing methane and carbon dioxide, of course, very potent greenhouse gases, lots of methane, and that is about 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide when it comes to global warming. So we want to reduce that as much as we can. And these emissions from our food waste and landfill are actually a substantial portion of our whole city's carbon footprint. So it's low-hanging fruit in the journey to becoming a lower carbon capital. Also, about half of what we send to the landfill could have been eaten. So I'm not talking banana skins and potato peelings here, but you know, bread that went mouldy, leftovers that sat around in the fridge for too long, things that got left on plates, or things that might have just got thrown in the bin at the end of the week and before the next shop. And this all does add up to costing us a lot of money as well, over $1 billion a year in food that could have been eaten but wasn't. So by reducing what we send to landfill, we can reduce those emissions, but also save a fair amount of cash. But I guess what I see as the underlying problem here is that we're throwing away something that's actually valuable, is actually a resource, not rubbish, because food waste is rich in nutrients, nutrients being anything that living things need to survive and grow, like proteins, sugars, vitamins and minerals, all that good stuff. So those nutrients might not be in a form that we want to eat, but nature has very efficient systems for recycling these nutrients back into soil so they can be grown back into food. So we should be treating these food scraps like a resource, not rubbish. But when we send them to landfill, they get locked up and cannot be recycled the way they ought to be. So here's just a short summary of the life story of our food waste when it goes to landfill. These nutrients, this is kind of the end of the road for these nutrients. Cool, so we turn instead to synthetic fertilizer to supply our crops with nutrients, but this also does have associated pollution with it, as well as that food waste piling up in the landfill, so it's not a very sustainable system. Composting is the missing link here. It's the way that we can recycle those nutrients in our food scraps back into soil and ultimately into fresh food, reducing or avoiding this pollution, and it's a much more sustainable system. So in summary, solutions to our food waste problem, firstly, to reduce what we waste and to compost the rest. And this is really good outcomes for both our environment and our pockets. Keeping it local is best, and of course you can't get more local than composting your own food waste in your backyard. So hopefully now I've convinced you that composting is worthwhile if you weren't already convinced. We know it's a way of recycling those nutrients, but how does it actually happen? And this is the focus of the rest of the workshop. We start by talking about decomposition. That's just the process of something breaking down further and further over time. And it's the fundamental part of this recycling process. So anything that was once alive, organic material, can be decomposed by nature to return these nutrients to the soil and to new growth. And this process is happening everywhere around us all the time. Everywhere you can see new growth is where nutrient recycling has been happening behind the scenes to make that possible. Think of the leaves in a forest floor or a fallen tree in the bush. Those nutrients are gradually being broken down and recycled. And the hardworking critters behind this process are diverse, from the very, very small bacteria and fungi and other microscopic organisms up to things that we're more familiar with, like earthworms and insects. And decomposers tend to get a bit of a bad rap because they're kind of seen as gross for living on decomposing matter, but they are so, so important. They really keep the engine of the ecosystem working. So they deserve a bit of respect and a bit of care. So all composting is controlling the decomposition process at a larger scale so that we get something that we want out at the end. Food scraps are still going to decompose in your fridge, but after 4 months, probably are something a lot less appealing than if you composted them properly. So composting is just a balancing act of your food scraps, other ingredients, water, air, and shelter, anything that any living thing needs to survive, including the soil food web recyclers that are at the heart of this process. And what is the end product? Compost is broken down organic matter. It contains nutrients that plants can easily take up through their roots. It's full of beneficial soil life, from the very small to the worms and insects, and it's just a health booster for soil. And adding compost to our soil improves the health of soil. Of course, healthy food starts with healthy plants, and so we need to be feeding our soil to feed ourselves well. Soil with more compost and that good organic matter in it also acts like a sponge. It can hold on to moisture a lot better, and that's important when we have, big drought seasons. Our crops have a much better fighting chance of making it through. So it is a really big, wide world of composting. I never could have realized how much there was to learn when I started to get into it about 5 years ago. So composting can happen at any scale, from the backyard to the very, very large scale. But we're just focusing on 3 easy ways that we can compost at home: the Bokashi system, the worm farm, and the classic compost bin down the bottom. These are all living systems, so they do all need some care to stay healthy, but it isn't rocket science. Problems can always be fixed. It's so you can think of it like an experiment. Observation is important, checking in with your compost, seeing how it's going, tweaking what you're doing every now and then. And yeah, it can be a really, really rewarding process, and can save a fair bit of money on rubbish bags as well when you're not putting your food waste in. So each of these systems kind of harnesses the power of a different kind of composting organism. The Bokashi system is a microbial system, and lactic acid bacteria are the star of the show. So these guys create an acidic environment. It's similar to the yogurt making process, but you don't want to eat these ones. And by making it acidic, it keeps out bad bacteria that we don't want in our food waste. Worm farms, no prizes for guessing. That's worms, a specific type of worm called the tiger worm or the red wriggler. So these guys love to feast on actively breaking down really rich material like your food scraps. Inside your classic compost bin is actually a whole micro ecosystem working away. Pretty much everything in the soil food web is going to be living inside your compost. So that's just going to guide us into the rest of the workshop, which is how to take care of that specific system that you've chosen. You've always got to keep those, the living thing that you're trying to make a good home for in mind. Of course, you've got to start by separating your food scraps out if you're going to have anything to feed to your compost system. This is really easy to do by just having an ice cream container or caddy on your kitchen bench and just getting in the habit of putting your food scraps in when you're cooking or eating. This also makes it easier to see what's going to waste. With a rubbish bag, it's pretty out of sight, out of mind, but when you're keeping your food waste separate, you might be able to see, okay, maybe we don't need to eat that much bread or cook that much rice, etc., etc. Each of these composting systems has its specific likes and dislikes, which we'll get into soon. But everything needs to be chopped up for best results. Chopping things up makes it easier for your composting system and those critters to digest, so you get compost rather than mold. There are some general rules for what's good to go in and what's not good to go into your composting system. The good stuff, fruit and veggies, bread and pasta, nuts and grains, coffee grounds, tea leaves, any leftovers. You do want them to be fairly low in meat and dairy. Eggshells are good, but just wash them out first and crush them. And this is because in animal products can often live bacteria that could make us sick, so we just want to minimize them going into our compost in most cases. You can also put in pet poop from any herbivorous pets, so ones that are only eating plant matter. And not good to go in oil and other liquids. This is mainly because too much liquid is going to drown out your composting critters and make the environment nasty for them. Large bones, they're going to take forever to break down. You can make them into stock though. Rubbish and non-home compostable packaging. These will take, well, rubbish won't break down ever, of course, and your composting system won't get hot enough to break down most kinds of packaging. Cat and dog poop, kind of like animal products, are something to stay away from because they will contain bacteria that could be bad news for us. There are some things that are maybes, and it depends on the kind of system you're using. As you can see, Bokashi is the only method that's happy to take animal products, really. Compost and worm farm, best to stay away from because, yeah, they can lead to potentially breeding bacteria that can make us sick. The Bokashi system actually can process these products, animal products, in a safe way. As you can see, worm farm is the fussiest of the lot, and I'll explain why in due course. So for now, I'm just going to hand over to Tom, who's going to take us through the first method of composting.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Hopefully you can all hear me. Let me know if you can't. But yeah, I came into Kaicycle knowing very little about compost. I just used to think you just chuck it in a big heap at the end of the garden, and you know, eventually in a few years maybe there'll be something worthwhile, usable underneath. But what we're doing with a sort of cold compost system, which you'll see in the slide, is essentially creating the right environment so you can get really good quality compost in a lot quicker time. And first and foremost, here we go. Yep. So you're going to get this large 220 litre compost bin and a lid. It's a bit harder to demonstrate, obviously, on Zoom, but especially in Wellington, I think even though the lid is quite well fitting, we highly recommend you putting a brick on top or something just so that the lid doesn't go flying somewhere. But also maybe the most important thing is working out where to put it at the start. If you're taking this system, you probably have a patch of a garden outside or somewhere to put it, and that's probably where you want to put it, not on top of concrete or on your patio, because this is bottomless, this compost bin. The reason for it not having a bottom is so that any excess liquid can drain out easily, and also so enough air can come in underneath the bin and aerate the system. I'll talk about why that's important. But in order for that to work, you want to really put it on somewhere where that excess liquid and air can sort of get in. So ideally over some soil in a patch in your garden, somewhere that's not too far away, somewhere like that. And also a lot of people ask, like, does it need to get too much sun or too little? I think we sort of recommend somewhere it gets a few hours of sunlight a day, so it sort of helps up the system warm up a bit. But you don't want it to just be baking all the time. That might sort of put things out of kilter. What you'll also get is a wire mesh, which you put underneath. It's quite easy to sort of crimp around the bottom with your feet, and that's to stop any unwanted critters getting in, mice and rats and things like that. And also, last but not least, you have this turning tool. It's sort of just like a giant corkscrew, and you sort of it's very easy to use. You just sort of screw it into the compost and lift it up at regular places, and that's also to mix up the layers that you've put in, and also to aerate the system so it has enough oxygen to break down properly. So essentially what we're putting in is the two main things we're putting in, even though there's lots of things you could put in, like banana peel, potato peel, all these different things. We have to separate these things into two main categories, and they are greens and browns. So in the slide, you'll see on the bottom left, those, as the color suggests, those are the browns. And these are things that are quite high in carbon content. So things like, as you can see, dried straw and grass, wood mulch. You often see that a lot in big piles around the city. Sort of dried leaves. And also in the sort of metropolitan area we live in, where there's a lot of coffee roasteries, there's coffee chaff. And that's a really nice thing you can get your hands on for free. Often they ask for a gold coin donation. But all these things are easily accessible. We can give you a few more tips later on about where you get them individually. But these are your browns, your carbons that you're putting in, and these are essential to maintain a sort of balanced compost in this compost bin. And in the bottom right of the slide, you can see the greens. And these are mostly your food scraps, the things you're putting in your kitchen bin. So all those potato peelings, you know, tea leaves, coffee grounds, these things are higher in nitrogen content. And if we just put all of that in without the browns, it wouldn't be a very balanced system, and it would get very smelly and very, very quickly. So we kind of recommend sort of doing almost like a lasagna sort of style of putting, as you can see in the top right of the slide, putting in a layer of brown, layer of green, layer of brown, layer of green, about sort of the same amount of volume for each amount of green you're putting in, about the same amount of brown, maybe a bit more. And ultimately this stuff will get mixed up as you sort of use that turning tool to sort of aerate it and stuff, but it's just a good practice to get into to make sure there's sort of equal amount going into your compost system. Is there anything else? Yeah, is there a next slide, please? Okay. So a note about weeds. You've probably come across quite a few invasive species around New Zealand and in Wellington. You see them throughout sort of the bush and in gardens. They're spreading everywhere. And just bear in mind that these plants have evolved over millions of years to withstand a lot of, you know, knocking and knocking about and chucking around in various places. So if you put it into the compost system, don't think it's just going to break down immediately. Once you have compost and you put it on your garden, don't be surprised if you put in these pesky weeds in. There's a good chance that those seeds will have just survived and they'll just sprout up again. So just bear that in mind, that if you, yeah, some of those weeds won't break down as quickly as you would like. Yes, next slide. So yeah, troubleshooting. It's really important to say that anything that might go wrong is not sort of game over, oh no, I have to start all over again. Most of the time it can be fixed really, really quickly. So one of the things people sort of notice straight away and they don't like is, oh, it's smelling a bit weird. I obviously can't do a smellogram through this. I can't tell you what smells right and what smells bad. You can usually work that out yourself. But if it's smelling really foul, that's probably because either two things. Either you haven't got enough browns, which are those carbon things I mentioned, the mulch, the coffee chaff, dried leaves, things like that. And so you just add some more of those in, mix them all about, and that will sort of even out the problem. Also, the second problem is if there's not enough air in your compost system, yeah, it can start smelling quite badly. So you have two options there. Either you turn it a bit more with that compost tool, or you can chuck in, I forgot to say actually, we really recommend at the start of your compost bin, putting some really bulky items at the bottom, things like pine cones, quite bulky twigs, putting them a layer at the bottom, and that allows a lot of air to get in underneath because there's a lot of pockets of air between them. So yeah, flies is also a problem. It's obviously just not very nice to have them all buzzing around you, but also they can like lay maggots in there and stuff. You don't really want that. What we really recommend is always capping, like that lasagna method we talked about, the top layer after you've put your food scraps and you're finishing it, not going to come back to it for a few days. Put a layer of carbon on top, and that will sort of deter any flies wanting to lay their eggs there. Also, another advantage of getting coffee chaff from these roasteries is that it always comes in one of these lovely Hessian sacks, which are pretty much biodegradable, and you can just put that on as a sort of blanket, which keeps out the flies, keeps the warmth in. It's really good. Yeah, lastly, pests. I live in Brooklyn, and I didn't put any mesh around my compost bin, and the rats just burrowed under there immediately because it's just a huge free meal. So really make sure that's, hopefully in Miramar, you know, there won't be too many left if everything's going to plan, but if they are still around, they'll definitely check out your compost bin if they can get in easily. So just make sure that that wire mesh underneath is really crimped on properly. Is that everything from me, I think? Yeah, harvesting compost, yeah. So yeah, a question we get quite a lot is, okay, well, now my compost bin's full and I want to add more in. How do I use what's good? So you kind of have two options there. Either you set up another compost bin, but and sort of have one that's just sort of you leave for several months until it's ready, and fill up the other one. Or the other option is you sort of shimmy off the compost bin, because remember, it doesn't have a bottom. and you sort of take off the top layers that haven't broken down as quickly as the bottom layers. Hopefully at this stage, 3 or 4 months in, the bottom layers are starting to look rich and black and great, and the bottom right, as you can see, like that. And then you can use that stuff, put it on your garden, give it to a friend, whatever you want to do with it, and then leave the top layers that haven't broken down, like those bottom layers. So yeah, that the system is really easy to use because it's just plastic. You take yeah, just sort of shimmy it off and it should lift up quite easily. So it will be a bit of a job, sort of maybe get a wheelbarrow or bucket to sort of decant the layers, but it should be fairly simple. But I think that's, yeah, back over to you, the work farm.
All right, thank you. Check that I'm not on mute, good stuff. So the next method, next composting system that you may have signed up for is the worm farm. So if you haven't received yours already, it will be coming to you soon. On the left, you can see all the components of it. It's so easy to set up. You can do it in under 2 minutes. You could do a time test if you want. But you've got these main elements, which are the working trays, which are the parts that your worms are actually going to live in. And those are the bits that you'll be putting food scraps into. A lid, very important. The bottom collector tray will catch any liquid that comes out of the food waste in the worm farm as it does its thing, and a tap to take that liquid out easily. Your worms will be arriving after the worm farm, if all goes to plan, so they've got a home to go straight into. You'll also be getting a bedding block that looks pretty much like a brick, shaped like a brick. All you want to do is soak about half of this in a bucket of water, and over about 15 minutes it'll expand and turn into this really lovely, light, fluffy, soil-like stuff that is a beautiful bedding for your worms, which you put into the bottom of the top tray of your worm farm. Then when you get your worms, all you want to do is gently tip the worms out of the container and on top of the bedding, and that is all you want to do. You just want to, at that point, put the lid on and just step away and let them acclimatize for the next couple of days. In fact, when you're adding the bedding, if you add a couple of scoops of garden soil in with that, that'll just make the worms feel even more at home. So I'd recommend doing that. They will take a few days to kind of wriggle out of the ball of worms that they'll be in and start to explore their new environment. Of course, worms don't have eyes or ears. They sense mainly through their skin, so it takes them a while to get a bearing on their new home. And then after a few days of letting them be, you can start feeding them very slowly. I kind of say it's somewhat like getting a baby onto solids. You really want to try it slowly at first. Worm farming it's a really cool thing. It's fascinating. It's makes amazing fertilizer, but you do have to be pretty patient with it to start with. So you just want to try them on a few bits of food scraps, come back in a couple of days, see if they're getting stuck into them. They might need a bit more time. It could take them a couple of weeks to warm up to their new home. Don't worry, that's very normal. But once they do start to get into those food scraps and start eating them up, that's when you can start feeding them a bit more and a bit more, just really gradually. Over time, they will get used to everything. Their population will start to grow, and once they're fully up to speed and they're happy worms, they will be able to eat their body weight in a day. So they can chow through a lot of food waste once they're up and running. But it is just really slow to start with, and I can't state that enough. So don't worry if they seem to be a little chilly to start with. They do have sensitive skin, as well as sensing through their skin. They breathe through it. It's a really important organ. So as a result, they are not a fan of very acidic stuff like citrus fruits and spicy food and onion and garlic. So I'd recommend just staying off that stuff, especially when your worms are just getting going. Worm farming is an awesome experiment, so you can try little bits of these things and just see if they go for them or not. And if they don't seem to go for them and they just go moldy, probably best to not put them in. Onion skins and garlic skins should be fine because they are not the really acidic part. So the most common problem with worm farming is that you might find that your farming mold instead of farming worms, and that's just an indication that you are feeding them more than they can keep up with, so the mold is taking over. So just slow down that feeding if you're seeing things go moldy. Might be best to remove the stuff that's gone moldy and bury it somewhere else. Yeah, and you might also find some other critters living in your worm farm. This is not a bad thing. A healthy ecosystem is diverse, so other critters in there naturally brought in by this food source, they're fine. The only point at which you'd worry about other things living in your worm farm is if they seem to be competing with your worms for food, because there's more of them than your worms. So in that case, you might want to try feeding them something differently, reducing the moisture. The worm farm might be too wet. If the worm farm does get too wet, there can be a whole lot of little white worms called pot worms that move in. You shouldn't need to be watering your worm farm at all. There's so much moisture and food waste. But if you do see that your worm farm is drying up on top, just give it a light sprinkle of water. But not much moisture should be coming out into the bottom of your worm farm. There should just be a trickle, really. Maybe a couple of cups every few weeks at most. Yeah, so keeping that moisture level balance is important. If you're finding there are lots of flies, that's more of an unpleasant thing rather than a bad thing for your worms. Actually, maggot or fly larvae will help break down food waste as well, but it can just be a little bit less appealing when you're going in to feed your worms. So you can reduce flies by keeping a layer of browns on top. So what Tom was talking about before, dried leaves, ripped up paper and cardboard, a scattering of garden soil, or you can even use one of those Hessian coffee sack bags or an old towel to tuck in your worms after feeding them and keep the flies off. Just another note about your worm farm, you do mainly just want to be feeding food scraps, but every now and then you want to add a bit of ripped up paper and cardboard. This is like the bedding material for worms. So it doesn't just have to be that bedding block that you were initially supplied with. Yeah, paper and cardboard make great bedding, and it's a great way of using up kind of a bit of that paper and card recycling that you probably have lying around. And when you're adding bedding, you just want to soak it in a bit of water, squeeze it out, rip it up, and pop it in the worm farm. And worm farms like to lay their eggs on paper and cardboard, so that's a good way to keep your worm farm going. If you find that your worm population is going down, you may need to feed them more. So see how that's going. If you're seeing that you are feeding them, but they're still not liking that food, just try and change what you're feeding them. Give them a bit more diversity and see what they go for. Again, that observation is really important and it's fun. If you notice that some of your worms are stuck together, that is a good thing. That is how they breed, so give them a bit of privacy. If they start to turn yellow, they probably don't have some awful disease. They may just be pregnant, so that's another good thing. And if you see little white specks appearing and little tiny white and pink worms, that's a sign that you've got baby worms happening, that the worms are obviously happy and really settling into their new home. So at that point, you can really pat yourself on the back. If you are going away for a couple of weeks, that's fine. Just stock up their pantry before you go. Just give them a bit of extra food to get them through that time. If you're going away for a couple of weeks or maybe even more, you could look into giving them some straw, some pea straw, or some cut grass to eat, because that won't go moldy, but it will still give them a bit of sustenance. I think that's pretty much it for troubleshooting for now. And so you'll be stacking up your food waste and bedding materials into that top tray, and eventually it's going to be full to the brim. At that point, all you need to do is take it off the worm farm, swap it with the empty tray below. So you've got the empty tray on top, and then you want to just start, you put some fresh bedding into there, maybe the rest of your bedding block that you didn't use, a bit of ripped up paper and cardboard to cover the bottom, and then start feeding directly into there. And over time, the worms will migrate up through the holes in the bottom of the working tray, and into the fresh food. And that could take a very long time. They're pretty slow to migrate. They'll make sure they finish up whatever's in the bottom tray before they move up. So it could take 2 or 3 weeks for them all to move out. But once they do, what you should find left behind is a whole tray of beautiful worm castings, vermicompost, which is essentially just food waste that's gone through the worm system and come out the other end. So worm poo. It's such a good food for plants. Inside a worm gut is so much beneficial bacteria. So what comes out the other end is full of that beneficial bacteria that is really good for plant health. If you're finding that your worms are just not moving out of that compost and you want to use some, you can also just expose it to light. The worms will move away from the light and you can just scrape some off the top. So that's quite easy. Again, just remember to tap off that juice every now and then. That's also a useful fertilizer, very nitrogen rich, so it has to be diluted before using it. You want to dilute it about 1 part to 3 parts water at least, and then you can use it on your garden. That's the end of worm farms, bringing me to Bokashi, the last system as part of Para Kal. So this is an interesting system. It's a more modern one that originated in Japan, and it's actually a pre-composting system. It's a fermentation process. So what you'll be getting is 2 Bokashi kits, with 2, each kit has an outer bucket, an inner bucket, and a lid. All you do is put the bucket with holes inside the bucket without holes and put the lid on top. You'll also have these bags of Bokashi Zing, which is essentially just sawdust, inoculated with these Bokashi microbes, including the lactic acid bacteria, and a food source. So when you sprinkle that Bokashi on the food scraps that you're layering inside your Bokashi bin, that'll activate those microbes and they'll start working their magic on your food waste. So to start off your Bokashi bucket, just sprinkle some of that Zing inside the inner bucket, and then you can start lasagna layering your food waste inside. For every about 6 centimeters of food waste, you want to add about 1 or 2 tablespoons of the Zing on top. Squash it down. You can use a potato masher. That's because the Bokashi bugs don't like oxygen. So by removing the oxygen, by squashing it, it makes a better conditions for them to work their magic. You keep on layering that food waste and that Zing until you reach the top of the bucket, at which point you put it away in a cool, darkish place for about 2 weeks to allow the fermentation process to fully occur. Make sure that you're always keeping the lid on between adding food waste, again, because the bugs don't like oxygen. You probably also don't want to add in your food scraps more than once every day or 2, just to reduce that air getting in and making the conditions less favourable for the bugs we want to be thriving. So after the 14 days or so of just letting it sit and fermentation process happening, you do want to be taking the liquid off every couple of days just to stop it going smelly. Make sure when you're doing this, you're holding both buckets firmly. Tom once had a fun time not holding the bottom bucket and ending up spilling the liquid all over the floor, which it can be quite smelly. So make sure you're holding onto both those buckets. That liquid can be used as a drain cleaner. All the good bugs in there will outcompete any weird stuff growing in your drains. You can also use it as a fertilizer, but it's so rich and very acidic, so it needs to be diluted a lot, talking 1 litre to 2 teaspoons of Bokashi juice, but that is a good nutrient source for your garden as well. But again, if you can't be bothered, just tip it down your drains and that's perfectly fine, undiluted. So after the 14-day fermentation process, you will have in your bucket a beautiful food waste pickle, delicious. And the advantage of this Bokashi system is that it's kind of stabilizes these food scraps, so you can store them up for a lot longer, and they're not going really nasty. They're not going putrid. The food waste pickle does have a characteristic smell, kind of what you'd expect a food waste pickle to smell like. Sour, a little bit sweet, can be quite strong, but it certainly smells a far sight better than if you were just putting food scraps in a bucket and leaving it there for 3 weeks. So the finished product of inside your bucket of this fermentation process might look a little bit what you can see in the picture there. Obviously, that's not compost. So the next stage of the process is really important, and it involves burying this food waste pickle. You want to dig a trench about as deep and twice as long as your Bokashi bucket, and just arrange your food waste pickle along the bottom of that trench. You want to mix in a little bit of garden soil as you do so, and then just bury it over. And after about 2 months, that food waste pickle, thanks to worms and bacteria and fungi, will have processed that pickle into something that looks a lot more like soil than food waste pickle. You can go in and check how that process is going. And if it's looking like soil, you can dig it out and use it elsewhere on your garden, or you can actually just plant straight into it. So Bokashi is quite good if you've got plans to set up a garden bed in the future. You can start enriching that soil. So the most common problem you might encounter with Bokashi is mold. If you see fluffy white mold, like the photo at the top, that's actually not a problem. That's fungal growth, and that's actually beneficial to the fermentation process. But if you see blue or black or green mold, that is a problem. That's mold we don't want in there, and it's a sign that your Zing is in the middle of an intense bacterial fight with something that you don't want in there. So if you see a little bit of coloured mold, what you can do is try and just add a little bit more of that Bokashi Zing and see if the lactic acid bacteria can win. But if they don't seem to be winning, best to just abort that batch and yeah, call it an experiment. Dig a trench and bury it, and you may want to wear a mask while you're doing that, just if you're worried, or just try not to breathe in that mold, just in case. And then you can just start your batch again. So if you're smelling a bad smell, not like that characteristic and charming Bokashi smell, that's sweet and sour, but more of a rotten eggs, rotten milk smell, like putrid food, that's also a sign that something's not happening quite right. Be sure to keep the air out of the system as much as possible. Keep that lid on, don't open it too often. Maybe you need to be adding a bit more Zing when you're adding food waste in. Cutting food up smaller will help. The Bokashi bugs digest that food scraps. And just remember to drain that liquid off the bottom while it's sitting in the dark corner and fermenting for the 2 weeks. Again, you'll be soon able to get your how-to guides that will reiterate some of these common things, and you can always contact us at any point for help with anything that could be going amiss with your Bokashi or any other system, and I'll detail that a bit more very soon. So just a few last tips in summary, I guess. The better that you look after your composting system and critters, the better they'll look after you. So just following these kind of guidance that we've gone over today, and what you'll be getting soon in City Council's how-to guides. So by following all these processes, you can keep your compost safe, keep it healthy, and that'll be safer for you as well, and make better compost. But it is good to remember that while we are working with microbes that are great for composting, they're not so good for eating necessarily. So just always good practice to wash your hands well after harvesting compost or handling the systems. If and your house is immunocompromised, they may want to take extra measures like wearing gloves and a mask when handling. If someone does get sick and you're worried it could be compost related, best to just call Healthline rather than emailing us, because we might take a day to get back to you, and the number's there. But just bear in mind that composting is as old as human civilization. We're surrounded by microbes every day in everything we do, and just practicing common sense, washing hands regularly is what we need to do really, and following those good practice composting tips. If something is going funky with your compost, better to get on it sooner rather than later. It will be a lot easier to fix. And again, we'll be here to answer any questions you have. If things don't go right first time, that is totally fine and to be expected. Composting is an experiment, and no one ever learnt anything by getting it right first time. So just enjoy the learning opportunities, and we're here to support you. So here's how the rest of the trial is going. You've already done the first 2 things, which is awesome. If you haven't received your composting system already, you should be receiving it very soon. And online, you'll be able to find those how-to guides and videos that go over the key points that we've discussed today. So then you should have all you need to start using your system. Around the end of the month, or maybe next month, you can expect to get a phone call from a different group which are doing the surveys for this trial. They're called Gravitas, and they just want to ask you some questions to see how you're getting on with the composting system. Yeah, tell them everything honestly. That's the citizen science work that you're doing, and every experience that you're having is really useful to know. The second survey will be next year towards the end of the trial. And in the middle, we'll be running 3 more events for the Para Kal Home Composters group in December, March and June. And this is just a chance to, I guess, get back together, do any extra troubleshooting, talk a bit more in depth about composting and what to do with your compost once you've made it, get involved in other food growing projects. The Miramar and Mopuia Community Centre on Chelsea Street is our base for this trial, and there are some really cool other projects going on there, like community gardening, that you'd be more than welcome to get involved with if you want something to do with your compost and can't garden at home, or just want to check out what's happening there. We'll also be providing carbon materials, browns, that Tom talked about at these events, so that if you are doing the compost bin method, you can easily grab a bunch to make sure you're adding enough. And throughout this whole trial, you can fire through any questions through to us at the email address here, food.waste@wcc.gov.nz. So just a few last things to reflect on before we go to Q&A. What does Para Kal mean for you and your whānau? Maybe it's a way that you can practice kaitiakitanga in your everyday life. Composting at home is a way we can take care of our environment and take action on climate change in a very easy everyday way. So that's pretty awesome. You may find it leads to you saving money on food because you're seeing what's going to waste and just being a bit more aware about the food supply and where our food's coming from and the value of it. What will you do with your compost? Maybe you have already got a veggie garden at home or want to start one. And what does Para Kal mean for Miramar, Te Motu Kairangi, esteemed island? We've actually got 1 in 7 of Miramar's households involved in the trial, either with the home composting or the curbside collection, which is really fantastic because that's really setting Miramar up for creating a culture of composting and getting more food out of the landfill and into composting and local food growing potentially. Either way, you guys are leading the way to a more sustainable city. So again, good on you for being part of this trial, and hope you enjoy it. So now we'll take 10 minutes to do some questions and answers. Please keep on mute for the recording purposes, and please send your questions through using the Zoom chat function if you haven't already. Again, anything we can't answer in time, we'll answer in a blog post, or you can email us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we'll do some questions. Cool. Hey, Tom, have you got some questions for us?
Yeah, there's a couple, because I'm better at the sort of cold compost ones, less so with the worm farms and Bokashi. So there's a couple of questions that I couldn't answer. Awesome. One was the Bokashi grains, when asked about, they were sort of halfway through their sack and they wanted to check, does it ever go off? Does it have an expiry date?
That's a really good question. It should be pretty stable for a long time. It should be pretty happy in the bag. If you're finding that you're adding plenty of zinc, but your Bokashi process isn't happening the way it should, maybe you got a bad bag of Bokashi, and yeah, get in touch at that email address and we could try to get you some more. But it should be lasting for a very long time in those bags, like talking years.
And the other question was worm farms. Where in the garden's the best place to put that?
Great question. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. It's a good idea to place that out of direct sunlight, just because the worm farm is black. It's going to get hotter. It's going to attract that sun and keep that heat, and you don't want to cook your worms. So yeah, not in full sun, part shade should be fine. You could even keep it inside in a garage or carport. Yeah, it doesn't need sun. Worms are pretty good at, they're not too fussy with temperature. It shouldn't bother them if it gets down to, you know, a few degrees above zero. Yeah.
And I don't know if everyone saw that in the chat, but someone asked, which is obviously a big part of Bokashi's, what do you do with it once you've processed it? Where do you take it if you haven't got a garden yourself? So we found out that in most gardens at Mount Vic, they welcome compost donations. So yeah, that's at Mount Vic. I haven't been there myself. I need to go, but yeah, I think that it's the same. I just had a quick look at their website. It's the same rules of obviously, you know, don't put in sort of things like the weeds that we talked about or bits of plastic and stuff like that. So it's but obviously you'll probably be doing that very well. But yeah, that's great to know that you can take it there.
Yeah, totally. And Innermost is beautiful. It's well worth a visit, even if you don't want to take your Bokashi. Also, the Miramar and Mopuia Community Centre, they can accept your Bokashi. They have a community compost, and actually, me and a buddy from Kai Cycle will be going there in the next couple of weeks and building a bigger compost system for them. So they're more than happy for Bokashi drop-offs there or to bury it there. But yeah, so that's another option if you can't bury it at home.
Cool. I think that was the only questions that I was unable to answer, but let us know if there's anything else I didn't see or any other questions you may have. But I think that's everything for now.
Awesome. Maybe if you've got any last questions, just feel free to flip them through now. We'll stay on, we'll take another couple questions. Do we have any parting things we forgot to mention, Tom, or any parting reflections?
No, I think, yeah, the main thing I want to pass on to anyone who's like, this sounds scary, is like, and I mentioned it, but I think I should say again, like, if it looks wrong, smells wrong, feels wrong, it can normally be fixed. So if it's too dry, add some water. If it's too wet, it probably means I'm talking about the cold compost here. That's the one I know best. If it's too wet, then, you know, it's probably not draining well enough. So add a layer of sort of pine cones and big bulky twigs at the bottom. Things like that. So it can normally be fixed. Add more browns, maybe there's too many greens. So yeah, don't feel like I have to start all over again. Just listen to your compost. It sounds a bit corny, but yeah, we'll usually tell you what's wrong with it, and you can respond.
Totally, nice one. Yeah, I guess a parting thing for me is that this trial does go for a year. So it will take a while, possibly, to get into a habit of separating your food scraps, separating the right food scraps, chopping it up, feeding the compost in the right way. But you do have a year to get the hang of it. So just, yeah, find a system that works for you and your family. Try and get others in your family or household on board. Let them know what can and can't go into the compost. You might want to have a compost monitor, compost boss in the house, who makes sure that all the things going in are good and everyone knows what the story is. Maybe that can be swapped around if you've got a weekly chores roster. But yeah, you'll find a system that works for you, and there's no one perfect way of composting. And it is, you know, you might find a better way. You might find an excellent way of composting. And yeah, so do just experiment, try different things, see what works and what doesn't, and we'll look forward to Para Kal Home Composters event in December, where we can come back together and share what we are finding that is working and what isn't working, so we can learn from each other. Cool. Okay. Well, in that case, should we close? Okay, great. I've got a closing karakia for us. So again, feel free to follow along wherever you are. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Great, and thank you so much for coming, and happy composting, and we hope to hear from you soon. We're also sending out a workshop survey, which you should receive soon. So if you can take just a couple minutes to fill that out, we'd be really grateful. And thanks again for coming. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening.